because of the sunshine, as Father Charlie mentioned. And so we have a beautiful night. I welcome all of you to our conversation series. I'm Lauren Brown. I know most of you. And so if you haven't been to the Foundation before, welcome. Welcome back if you've been here before. Our topic tonight, awakening from the American dream, the gap between the rich and the poor. Before we get started with that, a few housekeeping items. The restrooms are just out these doors here, straight ahead. And feel free at any time to restroom or beverages over here, snacks, anytime tonight, please do that. I want to thank St. Gabriel Radio, again, for partnering with us to provide the radio coverage and replaying of our series, our conversation series. So thank you, St. Gabriel Radio. Social services is one of our 4 pillars of support by the Foundation. And you'll see over here by the street side our 4 pillars that describe us, plus our middle pillar that has them all in there. So social services, vocations, parish life, and Catholic education. Last year we funded social services to over $1.5 million in grants, and we expect to be at that much or more this year. It's a great need out there in many of the ministries in our diocese, and now all Catholic as well. It's certainly in alignment with our Catholic teachings and values. So $1.5 million last year, and we expect to do more than that this year because of the generosity of our donors and our stewardship at the Catholic Foundation. So we're very pleased to be able to do that for the great needs in our diocese. About a year ago, Father Charlie and I had a conversation about what could we do to address the topic of social services, and he blended his passion for social justice. I have about 25 years of working in social services before I came here. And we blended that together and said, we need to do a topic about the gap between the rich and poor and social justice. And so tonight's topic was born out of that conversation. I want to thank you, Father, for doing this and for leading this conversation and for your support of the Foundation. That's why we're here tonight, this topic. I want to thank Mark Huddy, who's been here before to do our conversations, Rachel as well. Thank you, Rachel Lustig. And so, without further ado, I'm going to introduce them. Mark will go first tonight. Mark is Director of Office of Social Services for the Diocese of Columbus. He serves on the Diocesan Bishops' Council. And in his capacity, he serves as the mentor and administrator and the driving force to further the understanding of the Church's social justice teachings. Mark holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English from Ohio State and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Cincinnati College of Law. And Mark and Beth is here. Thank you, Beth. Are parishioners at St. Matthew. Rachel Lustig joined Catholic Social Services. We're blessed to have Rachel here. She joined us in 2014? 13. So thank you. And after serving mostly as Senior Vice President of Mission Ministry for Catholic Charities USA, she came to us. Rachel began her career with Catholic Charities USA in 2003. And over her years led the efforts to engage the larger Catholic community in outreach and social justice as an expression of faith. She received her Bachelor's of Business Administration from the University of Notre Dame, fellow Domer, and her Master's in Public Administration from George Mason University in Virginia. She's a member of Immaculate Conception Parish. Father Charlie has been pastor at St. Paul, Westerville since July of 2003. He earned his bachelor's and master's from Ohio State University and a PhD in medieval history from University of Minnesota, as he told me to say it. He completed his seminary training at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where he earned a master's in divinity degree. And during and after his graduate studies, Father Charlie also taught college history. He's very interested in public affairs. He was very interested in public affairs even before being pastor while in Minnesota, and was involved in local and presidential politics. He currently serves also as the chaplain to the Diocesan Council of Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Father Charlie was ordained in 1983 as a priest in the Diocese of Columbus, and previously was pastor of Plain City, St. Joseph, and at Zanesville, St. Nicholas. He also taught at the Pontifical College, Josephinum. So please join me in welcoming our panel tonight and our topic.
Thank you, Lauren. Tonight we're going to start a conversation. That's kind of what the conversation series at the foundation is all about. And we're going to talk about something that's important and something that's hard to talk about. We're not here to assign any blame. We're here to open the conversation so we can find our way. Now, I'm not an economist, but we're going to talk a little bit about economics tonight. And my grounding for opening this conversation is that we have 4 children, and we used to have family meetings from time to time. And those family meetings were times when we had to talk about something important and something that was hard to talk about, and try to do that in a way that we didn't assign blame. And we tried to open that conversation so that we could find our way. I think my other role here is the church's teaching is a wonderful guide for us. And so in the handouts that we have for you tonight, there is a sheet called Meditations on Economic Life. And that 6 pages or so includes some quotes from Pope Benedict on economic life, some more quotes from Pope Francis on economic life, some quotes from the U.S. bishops as they reflected on their pastoral statement, Economic Justice for All, and some resources for you on the back of that. And so in our work with social concerns, while we're not economists, we're concerned about policy, we're concerned about how policy affects the life we live. And that's what I hope to bring a little bit of tonight. When I was a boy, and for many years both before and after that, our nation and the people in it subscribed to a blend of aspiration and remembrance, hope and history that we would call the American dream. And at least for me, as a boy growing up, it meant that anyone willing to practice the virtues of hard work, perseverance, self-betterment, and a pinch of luck could succeed in the land of opportunity and have a good life individually and for their family. Work ethic and learning were the keys to unlock the door to the dream of fulfillment. And everybody had a really good chance, or at least we believed that everybody had a really good chance to live the life that they wanted to live. Now, the term the American dream actually was a term that was coined sometime during the Great Depression. And that term was coined by a fellow by the name of James Truslow Adams. He had written a book called The Epic of America, and he used in that book the term American Dream. That's the first time it was actually used as a term. And in describing it, he said the following, in describing the United States. He said, "It is a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position." Now, if we fast forward to today, there was a report that came out in September of 2014 from the U.S. Census Department, and it gave us some statistics that were somewhat startling. One of those statistics was the income of the median U.S. household was lower in 2013 than it was in 1999. After adjusting for inflation, it was 8% lower than it was in 2007, before the Great Recession began. Now again, reminder for what median income means. Median income is the income in the middle. So median income means that half the people are above it and half the people are below it. Median income is that income right in the center. That same report noted that the average income of the bottom fifth of earners had fallen 16% since 1999. While the report noted that the official poverty rate had dropped 0.5% to 14.5 in the United States, it still left 45.3 million people living in the 51st U.S. state, the state of poverty. So when we think about that, it seems like reality's alarm clock is awakening us from the American dream. Our challenge is tonight we want to read the signs of the times, as John the 23rd told us to do in his encyclical Peace on Earth. We want to consider our responsibilities and our responses to the phenomena of poverty and the growing income inequality in our country. Just this week, there's a publication called Origins, which is a Catholic News Service publication, and it reports on documents and pastoral letters from bishops in the United States. And so just this week, the Indiana bishops were cited in Origins. They released a pastoral letter entitled Poverty at the Crossroads, the Church's Response. And in it, the bishops of Indiana used the very simple formula, see, judge, and act, to invite and challenge everyone to be more attentive to the poor, to identify the systemic issues that keep individuals and families poor, and to take concrete steps to reduce the long-term impact of poverty, even as we continue to reach out to help those suffering from poverty with their immediate needs. So my job in this trinity of presenters is to help us better see what is really happening in our communities, and to better see to whom it is happening, and perhaps even to see what resources we can bring to bear on the situation itself. In what we used to call the pastoral cycle, this would be called social analysis. And Father Charlie will follow me with the judge portion, which we would call theological reflection, and Rachel will follow with the act portion, which is what we can all do about it. There's a lot of stats that I'm going to throw at you tonight, but we don't want to lose sight of one fact. And that's, as we're seeing what's happening, first and foremost, it is happening to persons endowed by God with the dignity of his children, made in his image and likeness. That means it's happening to our neighbor in need, or stated another way, to fellow members of God's family. There's an old joke that might be appropriate as a kind of starting point for us tonight. There's three guys on the shore of a lake. A big storm has come up, and there appears to be a man drowning about 50 feet offshore. And so one of those men, the rugged individualist, runs to the nearby boathouse. He assesses the situation. He sees the man is about 50 feet offshore, and he gets about 25 feet of rope, attaches it to a life preserver, and throws it out to the man who's still drowning. And the second man says to him, "What the heck are you doing?" Says, "The guy's at least 50 feet out there. You've just attached 25 feet of rope. What's going on?" And the rugged individualist says, I want him to show a little initiative. So the second man goes to the boathouse and he attaches 125 feet of rope to another life preserver and throws it out to the drowning man. It was hard to throw because with all that weight, it was hard to get that rope out actually that far, but the man actually does get to the life preserver, holds on to it a minute, but unfortunately, the liberal do-gooder has left to do another good deed. And so there's nobody at the other end of the rope. Finally, there's a Catholic who goes to the boathouse, actually attaches 50 feet of rope to the life preserver. He calls out to the man whom he recognizes, first of all, as the postman in the town. He says, Joe, take a hold of this life preserver. And was able to rescue Joe. A few things instructive in that story. It's the Catholic perspective that calls us to recognize people by name and to recognize what resources we have and to be effective in using those to help people in a way that can be truly helpful. If we're trying to talk about poverty, we have to have some definitions. And so the first thing that we want to do, and I've been apparently pressing the buttons here on this computer, so I'll have to see if I can figure out how to make any of my slides work.
Do you want me to go back, Mark?
Yeah, if you can. Yep, got it. Okay, I
Are
think we
you
can do
pushing
it.
too?
I think we're going to get there on what. But Father Larry Snyder, no, you're doing fine. No, actually, I got to go backwards. That's all right, no problem. Father Larry Snyder has been, until just recently, the head of Catholic Charities USA. And in a book that he wrote in 2010 called Think and Act Anew, published by Orbis in 2010, he has some questions to help us identify who it is that's actually in poverty. And those questions go something like this. Someone is poor if they cannot afford housing that is clean, safe, and in good repair. So we think about who in our community can't afford housing that's clean, or in a safe place, because a lot of the housing that's out there is not in a safe place, or in good repair. Or they cannot afford nutritious food for themselves and their family on a regular basis. Or they cannot consistently pay their utility bills, even though it's a priority. Or their children are not adequately clothed for school with clean clothes that fit and are in good repair. Or they do not have proper clothing for work. Or they cannot afford to go to the doctor for any kind of illness for fear that the visit will be beyond their means to pay for it. So those are a couple of definitions that sort of go beyond the statistics for us. If we look at this graph, this comes from the Ohio Poverty Report in 2014, and this graph illustrates the variation in Ohio's poverty rates since 1959. Poverty fell from 15.9% to 10% by the end of the 1960s, and continued diminishing to 8.2% in 1974. The poverty rate rose thereafter to 13.2% in 1983 and 1984. It fluctuated around 13% for the next decade before falling to 10.6% in 1999. However, since the turn of the century, it has risen to 16+%, a level not seen for at least 50 years. This graph also illustrates the gradual convergence of Ohio's poverty rate with that of the nation, which had been substantially greater. If we look at the same kind of graph covering poverty rate for families, we have similar data. Ohio's family poverty rate fell from 13.2 to 7.6% during the 1960s and continued falling to 6.6% by 1974. It rose to 10.7% by 1982 and stayed above 10% for all but 2 years of the following decade. It peaked at 11.2% in 1993 before falling to 8.2% in 2000, the lowest level since 1980. However, Ohio's family poverty rate has risen to 12% since the turn of the century, a level not seen since sometime in the 1960s. Again, you'll see that gradual convergence between state and national family poverty rates. The American Community Survey data show us that about 349,000 families in Ohio were poor during the 2011-2012 period. I'll get my slide to change. Amy, got a there we go. Thank you. And this just shows county poverty rates in the 2008 to 2012 period. If you notice the red areas, those are the counties with the greatest poverty. And if you notice that, there's a fair number of those that are in our diocese. In fact, the majority of those red counties are in our diocese. So we have Vinton, which has a poverty rate of 21.4%, Jackson, which has a poverty rate of 24.8%, Pike with a poverty rate of 22%, and Scioto with a poverty rate of 23.0%. There's only 4 counties that are not in our diocese, and they are spread across multiple dioceses. So again, just getting a sense of what we're facing here in the Columbus Diocese. If we look at the next slide, the Ohio 12 largest cities poverty rate, you can note that between 1999 and 2008 to 2012, poverty grew in each of the 12 largest cities in Ohio, from Akron and Canton all the way up to Toledo and Youngstown at the far end of that graph. Coming out in March this year, the Ohio Association of Community Action Agencies published a report about the state of poverty in Ohio. And this was an interesting graphic that they produced. And it shows the real cost of items in the 50 years since the war on poverty began to be waged by President Johnson in 1964 and the end of 2014. And you can see, of course, wages and you can see those differences in wages and the cost of consumer items. Some of them are fairly striking, and if we go to the next slide, you'll notice that while the cost of certain items like clothing, televisions, and new cars actually declined, if you look at it as a percentage of income from 1964 to 2014, there were huge increases in the cost of child care, in the cost of health care, and in the cost of college tuition. So if you're looking, gasoline is not to be missed on that graph either. So those are the big ones. Rent and groceries increased by somewhere around a doubling factor, but there were huge increases in child care, gasoline, health care, and college tuition. And if you wonder why, on a relative basis, that seems to have happened, we can look at another graph that shows us the occupational growth rates since 2001. And you see that lower wage occupations actually increased in the period of 2001 to 2013 significantly by about 8%. Higher wage occupations increased by about 6.5%. But middle wage occupations declined by nearly 8% over that time period. Again, trying to understand poverty, we have to know how the government measures poverty. The federal poverty measure was developed in the early 1960s when President Johnson declared the war on poverty. It's the official poverty measure in the United States, and it's calculated by recognizing what is necessary. It's based on 3 times the minimum food budget. So that's how the federal poverty measure is determined. The supplemental poverty measure tries to take into account factors that the official measure doesn't take into account, like food, clothing, housing, and utilities. And so it's a different measure of poverty that's perhaps more accurate in trying to define how people are doing. Other types of poverty measurement that are important would be looking at what we would call the official poverty rate, which is an annual household income rate, but it does not distinguish between long-term and short-term poverty. The Census Bureau uses other data to estimate chronic and episodic poverty. Chronic poverty is defined as the percentage of the population in poverty every month in a 36-month period, and episodic poverty is defined as those in poverty for at least 2 months in a 36-month period. And you can see by this graph or by this chart, that episodic poverty is much higher than the official poverty rate in the United States, and is probably more reflective of what's actually happening with the population. Eight out of every 9 Americans who have lived in poverty experience it only short term. Given the nature of episodic poverty, many who get out of poverty only to fall back in again are not accounted for in the official FPN, Federal Poverty Measure accounts. If we look at something called self-sufficiency, the Ohio Association of Community Action Agencies has graphed for us a graph that shows the federal poverty level threshold at $23,000 for a family of 4, $23,600. A low-end self-sufficiency wage, which would actually be $46,780, and a high-end self-sufficiency wage of $56,861. And you might ask, well, what does that take into account? The Ohio Self-Sufficiency Standard takes a look at housing, cost of rent, utilities, property taxes, child care, full-time child care for infants and preschoolers, and before and after school care for children who are in school. Food is considered in terms of groceries. Transportation is considered in terms of what's necessary to get actually to work, and 1 weekly shopping trip. Healthcare, which is employer-sponsored healthcare costs and the out-of-pocket money that people are required to put in to get their healthcare. Taxes, federal, state, income and sales taxes, and miscellaneous items like clothing, household items, cleaning items, toiletries, diapers, over-the-counter drugs and medicines, and telephone. And so if you account for those, you have to significantly increase what we would call the poverty line. And that's what that chart is trying to show. You can actually go on the Ohio Association of Community Action Agency website and calculate how much a family of any particular size would need for that level of self-sufficiency. A couple other definitions that are important would be asset poverty. Asset poverty measures the financial cushion needed to withstand a financial crisis, and stay out of poverty for 3 months. Asset poverty doesn't look at whether the asset's liquid or not. So for most of people at that lower end, those assets are not particularly liquid. So if you look at the part of the graph that's on the left side, nearly half of Ohio households lack the liquid assets needed to stay out of poverty for 3 months. Here's another interesting part of the Community Action Agency study, and it shows us that really the suburban poor population in Cleveland has grown 6 times faster than the city's population since the year 2000. And if that isn't bad enough news, if you look at Columbus, since 2000, the city of Columbus and its suburbs have seen poverty grow 68% in the city and 126% in the suburbs, the fastest growth rates of urban and suburban poverty in Ohio. This chart just shows that as people increase their self-sufficiency, increase their income, they lose benefits. And oftentimes the increase in income doesn't make up for the benefit loss. So there are places where there are gaps. So as people are trying to meet their self-sufficiency needs, and then they can find themselves in what we would call a benefit gap. We used to see this a lot with people who were in the hospitality industry. As their wages would increase, they would lose the ability to get child care for their children, and then they'd have to quit because there was no child care. So a wage increase was actually a negative situation for them. Nearly 2 out of every 5 unemployed workers in Ohio live below the poverty line. 1 out of every 20 children born into the bottom of the income distribution in Ohio climbs to the top as an adult, while 8 remain at the bottom. Here's a great one on college costs. Since 1992, student debt in the U.S. has grown by nearly 130%, while income in those households has only grown by 6%. 7 out of every 10 students graduating from Ohio colleges and universities in 2012 graduated with student debt, which averaged $29,000 per student on graduation. Now, if you want to break that down just a little bit more, we can see the difference between public and private schools. Interestingly enough, in the public schools, if you looked at the top 5, Kent State had the largest number of graduates with student debt, 76%, and the highest student debt per graduate, $31,954. On private, the top 5 private schools in Ohio, Ashland had the largest number of graduates with student debt at 87%, but the University of Dayton had the most student debt per graduate at $40,628 on average. This one shows, the student loans outpacing other types of household debt. Student loan debt is the red line, and the other household debt is the blue line. Here's one that shows the earnings of college grads versus college costs. Again, you can see the purple line is the earnings from 1991 to 2008, and college costs from 1991 to 2008. Significant increase in costs and fairly stagnant earnings. This graph shows us a little bit about changes in wealth since 1984 for various percentiles in 2013 dollars. And really what we see there is, if leading up to the Great Recession, median family income, wealth, and that's really net worth, at the 50th percentile increased from $87,992 in 2003 to $98,872 in 2007. While the absolute increase at the median level from 2003 to 2007 was about $11,000, increases above the median were substantially greater. Net worth at the 75th percentile increased by more than $65,000 from 2003 to 2007. And if we go to the 95th percentile, it rose by more than $436,000, an increase of 36.3% in only 4 years. However, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, income declined for everyone. After 2007, wealth declined throughout the distribution, but the relative declines were smaller at the top. Looking over the entire period from 1984 to 2013, the 95th percentile still nearly doubled The 75th percentile increased by about 1/3. The median fell by 20% relative to its 1984 value. And the 25th percentile, which started at a very low level in 1984, had fallen by more than 60% in 2013. And the last of the graphs, yay, tell us that income gains, if we're looking at income, we just looked at wealth. The other way to look at it is to look at income. And if we look at the period from 1980 to 2010, we find that the top 1% had a 201% increase in income over that period. And if we look at the next 19%, their income increased by 65% over that period. The middle 60% increased by 49% over that period, and the bottom 20% increased by 40% over that period. So the big gains were in that top 1%. This is a chart on average and median wages and the relative ratio between average and median wages. So again, the average wages are increasing, and they're increasing faster than median wages because the wage increases at the top have skewed that average. And so if you look at the ratio, you'll see that the ratio is declining. If you look at median as a percentage of average, you can see that ratio decline. I want to show you a video that we ran across that I think helps us, again, get a good handle on what's happening.
Thank you, Mark. That really is a great video, so I'm hoping that Amy can bring it up. As Mark mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the scriptures and what guidance they give us on this topic. And also, of course, the church is concerned about this gap between the rich and the poor. There is something called Catholic social teaching, and the formal Catholic social teaching began in 1891 with the encyclical Rerum Novarum, which in English is roughly translated on the condition of labor. This encyclical was issued by Pope Leo XIII, so that's a long time ago. And this formal Catholic social teaching began in the light of the Industrial Revolution, which started at the end of the 18th and into the 19th centuries in England. And basically, it was a very slow and then began to be more a progressive evolution from a world which was basically rural and agrarian to a world that is urban and industrial. And of course, now we're in the post-industrial period as well. The big invention during the early stage of the Industrial Revolution was the steam engine, which propelled boats at first and then trains. So the Catholic social teaching is very much of a modern thing connected to the Industrial Revolution. The Hebrew Scriptures, however, are the origin of Catholic social teaching. I sort of prefer the term Catholic social teaching to social justice teaching because some people think that social justice teaching is too political of a term and might be used by people who are not necessarily on the same page as Catholic teaching is. So, however, there is such a thing as Catholic social justice, and in fact the term itself was coined by Pope Pius XI in 1931 in his encyclical called Quadragesimo Anno, which is the 40th year after Leo XIII's encyclical. And so Pius XI actually coined the term social justice. So let's look at the Hebrew Scriptures first, and I did have a little handout. You can follow along if you wish, if there are things that you don't know how to spell or whatever, and it might make it go a little bit more quickly so that we have time for Rachel, before we have questions as well, and hopefully we'll get to that video. So the Hebrew Scriptures, both the law and the prophets have something to say about the question of justice. And really, it is the law that we're talking about, because the prophets only told the Hebrew people, and especially their leaders, that they were not following the law about social, what we would call social justice, okay? So it's really embedded in the very law of the Israelites. And so it's not a question of charity. Charity always has a place, but it's a question of structural justice, justice for the society that we're talking about. So in Exodus, and I'm paraphrasing here, we can look them up if you want in the Bible to be sure that I'm right, but the law in Exodus: do not oppress aliens or wrong widows and orphans, do not exact interest on a loan to your neighbor, and you shall not keep a neighbor's cloak, which you have taken as a pledge or security on a loan beyond sunset, because otherwise you will be cold. Very simple stuff, okay? And the whole question of interest, of course, that's usury. For a long time, the Catholic Church, for example, in the Middle Ages, was totally against any kind of interest on a loan. So we got over that. But the idea is that you should not hurt your neighbor financially. Deuteronomy, the great law book: do not defraud anyone, whether a fellow countryman or an alien, and you shall pay all wages due before sundown, because the poor depend on them. And do not violate the rights of aliens or orphans, or take the clothing of a widow as a pledge. Consistently in the law of the Hebrews is take care of the widows, the orphans, and the aliens, which roughly translated today is the immigrants, by the way. We'll talk more about that later. And then also in Deuteronomy: do not go over the field of your olive, do not go over your field of grain, or your olive trees or grapevines a second time at harvest. But let what remains be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. A very interesting section here. Don't be too greedy, you know. Don't take everything. Leave it for the poor person out there. The rationale, according to Deuteronomy, for this good behavior is that you, Israelites, were once oppressed as slaves in Egypt yourselves, and so you remember what it is like to be poor. So the prophets, what do they have to say? As I mentioned, they complain that the law of God is not being followed. The prophets, Isaiah: your animal sacrifices nauseate me, says the Lord. So make justice your aim instead, and make a sacrifice that pleases me by redressing the wrong, hearing the orphan's plea, and defending the widow. Again, Isaiah: your fasting and your penance in sackcloth and ashes is not acceptable to me, says God, but rather I wish this kind of fasting: setting free those who are oppressed and those unjustly treated or burdened, sharing your bread with the hungry, sheltering the oppressed and the homeless, clothing the naked, and taking care of your own needy kin. These passages highlight the need to have interior conversion and not just outward show or external practices. Also in Isaiah, where the prophet essentially denounces land monopoly, which is wealth monopoly in the ancient world, because almost all wealth is based on land. He denounces land monopoly, joining house to house and connecting field with field, in a kind of greedy fashion, as one of the grave social evils among the Israelites. The Lord tells the prophet to go to the palace of the king and tell him to rescue the oppressed and not to wrong the resident alien, the orphan, or the widow. In the Hebrew Bible, aliens, by the way, are usually non-Israelites living in Israel, so that would be an exact comparison, analogy to immigrants today in our world. But they can also be Israelites of one tribe sojourning in the territory of another. Much like perhaps in our country several generations ago, when states were actually different from each other, or regions of the country were much more different than they are now. And then there's the idea of the Jubilee year, which I wanted to talk about, which is something that is part of the Hebrew consciousness. This was part of the law of Leviticus, one of those other 5 first books of the Bible, where it is stipulated that every 50th year, which is 7 times 7 years, the Hebrews didn't know how to count exactly in terms of modern ways of counting. Is why we have 3 days. Jesus rose after 3 days. It really wasn't even 48 hours, but we can't worry about that. But anyway, the 50th year, which is 7 times 7, which equals 50, there should be a Jubilee year, okay, where every person can return to his ancestral property, which was a farm, and in theory reclaim it if it had been sold. In this way of thinking, property could never really be sold, but only leased, and every 50th year it went back to the original owner. Scripture scholars are pretty much unanimous that this law was an ideal rather than a law that was followed in reality. But this ideal was something ancient and rooted in the consciousness of Israel. And it basically was the notion that Yahweh was the true owner of the land, and all the Israelites were his tenants, and that all the people should share God's land equally. Again, this was an ideal, but it's an interesting ideal. If an Israelite should be forced to part with his land, it should return to him or his family eventually. There was a strong Israelite conviction that land monopoly in the hands of a few was contrary to the will of Yahweh. Note that in ancient times, wealth was essentially based on property, as I mentioned, but today monopoly is more complex, but just as wrong from the Catholic perspective. In the social encyclicals, beginning with Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum in 1891, there is the constant theme that property rights are not absolute. They are to be protected, absolutely to be protected, but they are not absolute in that protection. And that the monopolization of resources to benefit a few is morally wrong. Let's go look at the New Testament. Of course, Jesus is at the center of the New Testament and the Gospels. The Sermon on the Mount, beginning with the Beatitudes, tells us, blessed are the poor in spirit. St. Luke, who has basically his own version of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the Sermon on Level Ground. These guys didn't remember things so well as just like we do in our time. We don't all have the same memory, but St. Luke was more blunt. Blessed are you poor. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Matthew says, blessed are you poor, says St. Luke. So that is part of the Beatitudes, which is the preface to the Sermon on the Mount. Scripture scholars say the Sermon on the Mount is the core of the Gospel, and the Beatitudes are the core of the Sermon on the Mount, the core of the core. So at the very heart of Jesus' teaching, where he who became poor for us, God owns the universe, okay? Very rich, God's very rich, very wealthy, off the charts here. But Jesus chose to be poor, and so poverty is on his mind as something that is important for us to emulate, to try to live simply. There's also an interesting interpretation of the widow's mite in St. Mark's Gospel and also in Matthew's Gospel. Some scholars argue that she was oppressed by having to pay what amounted to a regressive temple tax, which is a head tax. We are used to preachers telling us that she was so generous, which she was, of course, compared to the wealthy, and even to this day, that you can find all kinds of statistics that show that middle-class people, if there are any left, and poor people are much more generous than those who have a lot of wealth in terms of at least the percentage of giving. But there's an interpretation that Jesus wanted to point her out because there was something wrong with this system of where everybody had to pay the same temple tax. If you were a Jewish person over the age of 18, you had to pay a tax to keep up the temple. Now, I noticed that recently in Ohio, there has been a proposal to raise the sales tax and to lower the progressive income tax. So this would not be something that would be in accord with this tradition from the scriptures and from Catholic social teaching. Obviously, there's also the scene of the Last Judgment, where Jesus says, whatever you did for one of my least brothers or sisters, you did for me, which relates definitely to charity, but also to the structures of injustice in society. The Acts of the Apostles is very interesting, written by Luke, by the way, the same person who wrote the third gospel, where he says there was no one needy among early Christians because none of them ever claimed anything as his own, but rather everything was held in common. You're all familiar with this passage. And where all who owned property or houses sold them and donated the proceeds, and laid these proceeds at the feet of the apostles, who distributed them to the poor. So this is obviously not the only way to have a just society, but that's the way they took care of it, which is a very interesting way, and maybe not something that would work now, so that's all right, but this is something that's in the scriptures. Maybe it would work too, who knows? The Epistle of James. James is a very interesting epistle, and he's very pointed in what we would call justice teaching. James makes the point that faith without good works is thoroughly lifeless. James also bluntly wrote, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. The wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. And that goes back to the Deuteronomy quote too, where Deuteronomy, the law of Deuteronomy says you got to pay the guy by sundown. Okay, and certainly there is no doubt that those who are not paid a just wage today are having some of their wages held back. Those who are not paid a just wage are having some of their wages held back. There's also the question of the minimum wage. I saw a editorial in the Dispatch a day or two ago in which they were saying that wages should rise simply because of market forces. Okay, we're going to get back to market forces in a minute. But you should not have laws, at least not real laws, about minimum wage. Okay, so this is the whole idea of letting the market, the magic market, decide everything. Okay, this is not in keeping with Scripture. So this passage from James is pertinent today in our country and even more in other parts of the world where workers are not paid a living wage. James, like the Hebrew prophets, is laying bare the hypocrisy of those who have great devotion to God, but not to the poor. Martin Luther, by the way, called the Epistle of James an epistle of straw. He didn't like it because it didn't fit in with his idea about faith, faith alone. And of course, Martin Luther has gotten a bad rap from the Catholic point of view over the years, but it was interesting that he had no use at all for the Epistle of James, whereas Catholics have always looked upon it more favorably. It is interesting, to sort of wrap up here, it is interesting that Pope Francis is making more concrete, down to earth, the biblical teaching and the Catholic social teaching on justice by rooting it in human experience today, when so many people in the world are forced to live on the margins. One of the first words out of his mouth was margin. Okay. People are living on the margins. He wants a poor church to serve the poor. And I recently listened to a speech of the then newly appointed Archbishop of Chicago, Blaise Supage, who was once the rector of the Josephinum and a Sunday helper at St. Paul's in Westerville before my time. But I taught at the Josephinum when he was rector, and he was a great rector, and he's going to be a great Archbishop of Chicago. And I was able to go to his installation. I was invited, and I went. I decided I was going to go. It was a very wonderful experience. This speech by Archbishop Supage was given at a forum held last summer in June at the Catholic University of America, and it was a response to a talk given by Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga of Honduras, one of Pope Francis's closest advisors. Sometimes he's called the Vice Pope, okay, because he and Francis are very close. And remember that name, because I think he is going to make more news. Anyway, after Cardinal Maradiaga had his say, Bishop Supich, who was at the time still Bishop of Spokane, used his remarks to launch a strong critique of libertarianism. And Rand Paul, by the way, just said he was going to run for president. He's considered a libertarian, even though he's not a pure libertarian, because you could never get the Republican nomination by being a pure libertarian. But we'll do, that's something we can't talk about. But anyway, Bishop Supich used his remarks to launch a strong critique of libertarianism, which is growing in our country, which speaks about freedom in such a way as to maximize the autonomy of the human individual, whereas Pope Francis stresses the solidarity of the human community, which is a very Catholic perspective. And this is in The Joy of the Gospel, which I encourage you to read if you haven't. Bishop Supich made the point that for libertarians, market forces should be left alone, and that this will lead to prosperity for the greatest number of people in the world. This is the old laissez-faire idea of economic liberalism of the 19th century, which is coming back. Laissez-faire means let it alone in French, okay? And those of you who know history know that that was one of the tenets of 19th century liberalism, not to be confused with today's liberalism, okay? 19th century liberalism today is roughly libertarianism. 19th century liberalism was an economic liberalism, a laissez-faire political perspective, okay? Bishop Supich went on to say that Pope Francis, on the other hand, compared to the libertarians, is calling Catholics to begin to put traditional Catholic social teaching into practice by personally meeting the needs of the poor and then addressing the unjust structures that marginalize so many folks today. Bishop Supich said that libertarianism is teaching us, and especially young people, that it is okay to make as much money as you can as long as you are occasionally generous. The bishop also makes the point that the goal of autonomy of the libertarians puts pure libertarians, and there's plenty of them around, almost completely at odds with Catholic moral teaching, not only on social justice, but also on the issues of respect for life, since typically libertarians not only want this autonomy in economic matters, but also in the area of so-called reproductive rights. I hope that you might be able to just Google Bishop Blaise Supich's talk. It's a very good talk. And it also relates, of course, to that editorial that I talked about in the dispatch a day or two ago. I wanted to just read what Pope Francis said about economics, about what we're talking about, basically, in his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, which was published in the fall of 2013. And this is a quote: "We can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market." This is Adam Smith's idea of laissez-faire. "Growth in justice requires more than economic growth while presupposing such growth. It requires decisions, programs, mechanisms, and processes specifically geared to a better distribution of income, the creation of sources of employment, and an integral promotion of the poor, which goes beyond a simple welfare mentality." The Pope says, "I am far from proposing an irresponsible populism," which could be a demagogue, something that could be demagogue, "but the economy can no longer turn to remedies that are a new poison, such as attempting to increase profits by reducing the workforce and thereby adding to the ranks of the excluded." So I recently ran across a quote by a priest who said he had never heard a homily on the 10th commandment, do not covet your neighbor's goods. Okay? I might have to preach one so that there is one out there. And really, laissez-faire, the laissez-faire libertarian philosophy is really, if you really believe in it, is just simple greed. That's what it is. It's just simple greed. Because you're coveting the poor's goods. You're taking from the poor in order to increase your wealth, your riches. So, of course, that doesn't mean that every capitalist is greedy. I'm a capitalist. I have, anybody who has an IRA is a capitalist, okay? Or any kind of retirement portfolio, okay? I prefer to call it the free enterprise system. Sounds a lot better, okay? But we have this gap between the rich and the poor. And I grew up in the 1950s, which is the golden age of the middle class. And when I started to study history, you know, I became aware of the robber barons of the 19th century into the 20th century, you know, the Rockefellers and whoever else, the guy who built the library here in Columbus. They did a lot of good, actually, in many ways. But the robber barons, you know, when laissez-faire capitalism was riding high. And I thought we would never, ever see those days again. I thought we never would, but we're seeing them now. Okay? We're seeing those days. Gradually, the middle class is disappearing, gradually. And we are seeing that with this gap between the rich and the poor. So that went a little bit further than the Hebrew Scriptures, but it's all rooted there. Okay, thank you. And Rachel is obviously the action person because she's one of those who came closest to figuring out the technology.
Well, I won't say that I've got it figured out, but that's very kind. It's really such an honor to be able to have the opportunity to work with these two fine men. I learned, it's been fun. This is our third one that we've taken, and each one of them has changed what they've said, so I've had the opportunity to learn a lot as we've gone along. There are a couple things. How do we get mine up? If I can ask for your help on that. There are a couple of places that I wanted to start before we kind of jump into the how, because my role here for the diocese is to care for the poor. I get to run Catholic social services, so we get to help seniors live independently and help families to thrive. And so I get to see on a day-to-day basis what this pull of the growing income gap, what that impact has on families. And I don't think there's any better way of looking at it as our neighborhoods, because that's the way it impacts us in Columbus. What we do is, as you have an increasing wealth, we tend to go where there are good schools. We tend to concentrate ourselves around these pockets. So I'm going to show you, like I've got two maps that I'm going to show you, but one of them is what we're looking at and what we're calling an opportunity map. So what it does is it looks at neighborhood and housing, and it looks at transportation, and it concentrates them into opportunity zones. So this should look like a familiar place, our neighborhoods. What you've got in the red areas that you'll see in kind of your upper Arlington region, your Worthington, New Albany, are what would be considered very high opportunity zones. So these are people who would have safe housing, they would have access to enough nutrition, they would have low incarceration rates, high access to quality health. But right here in other pockets of our community, you'll find on the other end of the spectrum, very low opportunity zones. So places where people are dealing with high rates of vacancy, where you're dealing with pockets of people who struggle, where graduation rates from high schools are very low. Why I wanted to start there, because I think in its starkest terms, it came out in a very real way in a report that was put out by the Columbus Foundation just a few weeks ago. They looked at some of those opportunity zones and they said, you know what happens to people who live in them over time is that they deal with the cumulative impact of that lack of opportunity. And what that means for people in real life terms will translate to the number of years that they will live. In neighborhoods in Columbus, in some of our poor neighborhoods where you're dealing with low opportunities, like we talked about before, some of our neighbors will only live, on average, to be 63 years old. So if you're looking here at our pockets, those red zones, translated to the low opportunity zones, our neighbors will only live on average to be 63 years old. Conversely, on the other pockets where we've got high opportunities or high concentrations of these wealth, our neighbors will live to be 84 years old. This is Franklin County, where we're living, where what happens as we separate one wealth from the other translates into nearly 20 years of life expectancy. It's kind of startling. Now, what I find myself, I've been working in social justice for a while, and we tend to be the doom and gloom kind of people. So when it comes to action perspective, I think it's very important for us to begin in a very different place. So I've got a handout for you. It's at your tables. I'm going to let you all work along. Action steps, I think, begin very importantly in a very good place. We have to remember, first and foremost, as we talk about caring for the poor, that the best place that we can begin is if we begin from a place of remembering God's love. If we can start remembering that we're not asked to do this out of our own perspective or out of our own capacity, but that the first thing that we can do is recognize and remember that we are loved infinitely by God. Because all we're asked to do in our action steps is to share that love. And that's first and foremost. If you remember nothing else about what I say, the most important thing that we can do is to share that love that Christ offers us so freely. My parish back in Arlington, where I spent several years living, I had this wonderful pastor who was a 70-year-old man who would skip down the hallway screaming about how intimately and fully God loved each of us individually. And I think over 6 years or so, it finally got into my head how important and how significant this was, and how seldom we spend the time actually allowing it to seep in. And so, out of respect for Father, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just giving some of those things that I hope that we can start as we think about how we care for the poor. Right now, let's just look at a couple of these incredible ways that God is telling us that He loves us. So we, start with Romans. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor present things, nor future things, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature will be able to separate us from the love of Christ, Jesus our Lord. Or John, for God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, so that everyone who believes in Him might not perish, but have eternal life. Zephaniah, the Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty Savior, who will rejoice over you with gladness and renew you in His love. He will sing joyfully because of you. Or 1 Peter, so humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that He might exalt in you in due time. Cast all your worries upon Him because He cares. For I know well the plans I have in mind for you, says the oracle of the Lord. Plans for your welfare and not for your woe, so as to give you a future of hope. When you call me and come and pray to me, I will listen. And Luke, finally, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life and what you will eat, or about your body and what you will wear. Your life is nothing more than food, and your body more than clothing. Notice the ravens, they do not sow or reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. How much more important are you than birds? This is so critically important and so profoundly Catholic for us to remember and to begin from this place. Because our actions, we can do harm to the people that we try to serve. But as St. Vincent de Paul said, if we come with love, the poor will forgive us the bread we offer them. So it's why I don't want to seem like I'm skipping over my action step to spend some time here, but this is truly, I believe, made me a channel of your peace is what we're talking about. I'm not going to go through all of the principles that I had. My former work was in parish social ministry, so they're written from the perspective of how parishes can respond together. But I didn't want to skip over this part, that what we've got to do first off is remember that we're loved, and then second off, remember that each of us are blessed and broken. All of us are sinful and redeemable, and that with God's grace we can be more perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and skip on to that second batch of those characteristics where we're going to talk about the actions that our ministries take. So the first one is a little bit of a mouthful. The parish ministers to and with poor and vulnerable and suffering people, giving special attention to those who are poor without differentiating between who is a member of the parish and who isn't. When we talk about our actions and how we can provide service, I think the most important starting point is to remember that that all of us have something to give, and that all of us are in some way in need. There can be a tendency, especially if you're coming from a place of hard work or wealth, to kind of decide what might be in the best interest of others. And certainly it's a role that we need to play when we are parents or in that type of capacity. But when we're working with others, there's too often times what they need to do, rather than coming from a place of conversation and listening and finding out what others' goals are for themselves. So the second characteristic of good ministry and good ways to act really comes from, are we taking the time to be in relationship with people? Are we taking the time to appreciate what they have and what they have to offer? The next one is again a mouthful. So I'm not gonna do it. I won't read it to you. But let me just ask, have you all heard the saying, if you give a man a fish, feed him for a day. If you teach him to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Well, would you like to know what I think about that? Because too often, that seems like it's the end of the game. But there are a lot of people who don't have fishing equipment, and there are a lot of people who are not allowed access to the pond. So I think it oversimplifies things. So I've got a little bit of a diagram, and you've got a copy of it here for you, that really talks about how can we understand what the symptoms are of the issue that we're dealing with. In many cases, giving a person a fish is a very legitimate and appropriate response to what is the symptom of what they're dealing with. If somebody were to fall and break their arm, or if they were to have a tornado hit their home, the type of emergency assistance or the provision of emergency needs would really get at what the root cause of what's going on. So there are times where giving a person a fish is very appropriate to addressing what's really behind the edge, what's really going on here. There are other times where teaching a person to fish is absolutely appropriate. For many people who've grown up in situations where they didn't have access to good education, and they need the type of training that can help them get an appropriate job, a one-on-one type of interaction is critically important, as is when we're dealing with health issues or when we're dealing with mental health issues. An individual response, that teaching a person to fish is critically important. When we talk about, making sure everybody has fishing equipment, we're talking about actions that can strengthen the building blocks of a neighborhood. There's a lot of incredible examples in our community of ways that have done that. The St. Vincent Family Center, the St. Vincent Community Center, for example, it's a haven in the Linden area that's providing great responses to a community at a number of different ways. And then it becomes an integrated part into how that community and that neighborhood cares for itself. Our Lady of Guadalupe Center for the Catholic Social Services is another tremendous example that makes this happen, where it's about how can we bring the community together so that it can strengthen itself. So that becomes appropriate when we're looking at neighborhoods that have some of the traditional building blocks that have broken down. And then certainly, we need to also incorporate responses that are involved in structural change. So we need to be changing laws that are undermining the social, political, economic, and cultural norms that are problematic in our society. We've seen tremendous strides in the last 100 years. As a woman standing in front of you, I think I stand on some pretty high shoulders and pretty impressive work that has been done to kind of raise women's rights, for example. So all of that's an important part of how we advocate. On your slide and in your packet, I've got a couple of additional ideas that you can see about what might be appropriate responses in different situations. If we're talking about respect life, for example, an individual and a relief response, giving somebody, diapers in that situation could be one response, all the way to the advocating for just laws in the area of protection for an unborn child. My fifth characteristic is the one I'm most excited to be able to share with you. Because I'm a firm believer that our work can and must be based in relationships. And the best way to do it is to have the opportunity to listen to stories. And one of the things that we've been doing at Catholic Social Services that's probably changed the very nature of our work is to really ask the stories of our clients. It's changed our programs, it's changed our vision. And so I've asked Adriana Vegas to lead us in to tell us some of the story of one of the clients that she has the opportunity to work with. Adriana is our coordinator of the Our Lady of Guadalupe Food Pantry. So I'm going to invite her up here to tell some of the stories of the people that she has the opportunity to interact to our neighbors. So Adriana?
Buenas tardes. El día de hoy quisiera compartirles algunas de las historias que vemos cada día que una persona cruza la puerta para entrar al food pantry.
Today I'm going to tell you a story. Is this on? No. So today I'm going to tell you the story of ones that we have every day of the people who walk through our doors at the food pantry.
Y son las historias que nos motivan y nos impulsan a dar nuestro mejor esfuerzo en el trabajo.
And it's these stories that drive us to give our best effort in our work.
La historia del día de hoy es la de María. María es originaria de un pueblo muy pequeño en el Ecuador.
Today I'm going to tell the story of Maria. Maria is from a very small community from Ecuador.
María es la mayor de 4 hermanas y vive con sus padres. Su casa es pequeña, es de 10 pies por 10 pies y hace la función de recámara, cocina, dormitorio.
So Maria is the oldest of 4 children. She lives with her family, her parents and her 4 sisters, in a very small home. It's 10 feet by 10 feet. And that home serves as the bedroom, it serves as the kitchen, it serves as the bathroom, it's where the family lives.
Ellos comen solo una vez al día y dadas a esas circunstancias sus padres se enfermaron y sus hermanos dejaron de asistir a la escuela porque no tenían dinero suficiente.
So her parents got sick, and unfortunately her brothers forced her brothers to finish school. They had to pull them out of school so that they could pay for their parents' medical bills.
Al ver María esa situación tan triste que estaban viviendo y después de muchas noches de no poder dormir, tomó la decisión de emprender un viaje a los Estados Unidos.
So this was something that really dragged on Maria, so she thought about it for a long time, and after several months, she made the decision to move to the United States.
María no sabía lo que se enfrentaba. Un largo viaje de 6 meses, cruzando 8 fronteras de las más peligrosas.
Maria had really no idea what she was going to encounter. It was a trip of 6 months during which she had to cross 8 borders, some of the most dangerous that there are.
En los cuales María experimentó frío, hambre, dolor, echando de menos su familia, sus costumbres, todo lo que dejaba atrás.
So Maria experienced a little bit of everything. She was cold, she was hungry, she missed her family, her culture, her language. It was a very difficult time.
En esas noches interminables donde solo tenía un cielo lleno de estrellas como cobija, ella le rogaba a Dios que le permitiera llegar a salvo sin ser violada o asaltada.
On these nights where she would only have the stars to cover her, she would pray up to God that she would arrive safely without being assaulted or raped.
Después de 6 meses, María llegó a Columbus a vivir con 2 amigas.
After 6 months, she arrived to Columbus and moved in with 2 women.
Consiguió un trabajo de limpieza
She found a job as a cleaning lady,
y pudo comenzar a enviar dinero a sus padres.
and at that point she was able to send money back to her parents.
Poco tiempo después conoció a un caballero y se casó con él.
And a little bit after that, she met a man, and they got married.
Tuvo 3 lindos niños,
Just 3 beautiful children.
pero tenía necesidad y fue así como llegó al food pantry.
But they had need, and so for that reason they came to the food pantry.
María siempre se emocionaba cuando veía vegetales y frutas. Decía, ¡ay, esto es muy bueno para alimentar a mis hijos!
She always got so excited because we make a point to have fresh fruits and vegetables, and she wanted to provide healthy food for her kids.
Después de un tiempo, María regresaba a su trabajo, después de una jornada muy larga de trabajo, con la única intención de llegar a abrazar a sus hijos y tomar un merecido descanso.
So one day, she was heading home from work after a very long schedule, and all she had in mind was to be able to say hello to her children and give them a hug and rest.
Pero eso no pudo ser.
That
No
couldn't be.
pudo concluir porque lamentablemente María fue embestida por un vehículo.
Unfortunately, she was hit by a car,
Donde María y sus 2 amigas perdieron la vida,
and she and both of her friends died,
dejando a sus 3 hijos huérfanos, a su esposo viudo y a sus padres sin ayuda.
She left her 3 children orphaned, her husband widowed, and her parents without her support.
Ahora vienen los hijos a visitarnos con el papá al food pantry. Les ofrecemos comida y a veces queremos ser esos brazos de María para darles un abrazo y que sientan cerca a su madre.
Sometimes they come to the food pantry, the husband and the 3 kids. In fact, they were there yesterday. And all that we want to do is, in addition to giving them the hug, is to giving them the food, is to give them the hug that Maria would have given.
Es solo una de las muchas historias que escuchamos día con día. Pero gracias al esfuerzo de todos y en especial de la Fundación Católica, podemos seguir ayudando a esa gente.
This is one of the stories of the people that we have the good fortune to serve, and thanks to people like the Catholic Foundation, we have the capacity to continue.
Y exhortarlos a visitar a nuestro food pantry. Estamos para servirles cuando gusten.
Our food pantry is open if you would ever like to come and visit. Thank you, Adriana. So, in an era where it is very difficult sometimes for our lives to interact with people who are on the margins, I think it is just as important as those types of acknowledgement of what's the appropriate response to situations of poverty in our midst. I truly believe that the most important thing that we can do is to sit and to get to know the stories of the people that we share this great city of Columbus and this diocese with. So if we can ever help you to do that, we would be honored. So thank you.